Hello, and welcome to Book Circle Presents An Ever-Mounted Cavalry. I'm Earl Weinberg. Our heroine, Ivy, has seen some terrible medical problem developing with Brother Eugene, and it has upset her quite badly, but she's been assured that all will be well, and she indeed finds Brother Eugene quite undisturbed the next morning. Ivy was pleased to discover that Brother Eugene was coming over again that night, though he came only after supper. They listened to a little wireless, but the evening was dominated by Ivy's first lessons in chemin de fer. One of the first things she learned was that it was usually a gambling game. "I don't have much money," she said nervously. She had left home with 4 shillings. She presently had 3 shillings twopence. "That's all right," said Lieutenant Fletcher. He pointed at Brother Eugene across the table. "He has the vow of poverty." Brother Eugene smiled back with cheery ferocity. "I will be happy to teach you some poverty tonight. Don't worry, Ivy, we'll play for markers. Miss Blackholt, do you have any poker chips?" "I'm afraid not. I have a checkers set, but that isn't many pieces." "Oh, it can be anything. Matchsticks, buttons." "Acorns?" asked Ivy, who had noticed a big pile of them in the woods that day. "That would be fine," said Brother Eugene. "Shall we start with 30 each?" So Ivy ran back to the woods and returned with 120 acorns in a bag, and so began a new evening routine, with Brother Eugene coming over after supper for wireless and chemin de fer. "Was it something about the food that caused Brother Eugene's misadventure?" Ivy asked Miss Blackholt, proud of finding a use for misadventure. "Like the way some medicines should be taken on an empty stomach?" She remembered the mention of digestion. "That's a very good analogy," Miss Blackholt agreed. Another part of the routine, Ivy observed, was Lieutenant Fletcher and Miss Blackholt going into and out of the woods. They entered separately, but would be in the woods at the same time. Ivy was old enough to wonder if they were having romantic meetings in there. But on close observation, she thought not. She did not know how long a tryst took, having learned the word tryst from an adventure romance in Miss Blackholt's library. But these would be pretty short ones, she thought, a good smooch or two and back out. They didn't seem at all romantic otherwise, and one of them always carried a knapsack. Spring was coming on, and the new routine had been in effect for more than a week. It was Friday, and Ivy, she had earnestly assured Miss Blackholt, could stay up late, so they could have a marathon card game. The adults were agreeable. Ivy decided a marathon game needed more acorns, so she dashed out, paper bag in hand, to gather 80 more. Seeing the garage and moved by curiosity, she decided to look in on Blanco. Moments later, she burst back into the house. "Blanco's gone!" she cried. The grown-up stared at her, startled, and stared some more. "He must have gone into the woods," exclaimed Brother Eugene. He started to rise, but Miss Blackholt was up before him. She plucked a small bottle off a shelf and thrust it into Brother Eugene's hand. Then she shoved him toward the door. He left at a run. He could use his legs perfectly now. Miss Blackholt followed at a brisk walk. Lieutenant Fletcher took Ivy's hand. "We'll look for him around the village." He led her out the door and up the hill. Ivy looked back and saw Miss Blackholt marching out of the garage with the backpack. Then she had to trot to keep up with Lieutenant Fletcher dragging her along. "Where does he like to hang about?" he asked. "Blanco? Well, the school, I suppose. He comes to meet me there sometimes. Brother Eugene, I mean. And Blanco seems to like hanging about with us kids." Ivy knew she was envied for her equestrian escort and, in fact, enjoyed it very much. "I mean, it's hard to tell. He goes where he's ridden." "Of course," agreed Fletcher. "Have I done something wrong?" she asked, since he was still dragging her at a ferocious rate. "What?" He slowed. "Oh, sorry. No, not at all. Just urgency. Come to think of it, you'd better take the lead. As a matter of fact, I'm not sure where the school is." It was next door to the church, but on the far side from Miss Blackholt's house. It was closed now, and it was immediately apparent that Blanco wasn't loitering about. "Might he try to go back home?" Ivy asked. "I mean, I've heard about cats and dogs trying to go back to their old homes after a move. Where was he before?" Fletcher was leading her on a circuit of the schoolhouse and church, but he seemed much calmer now. "A little town in Berkshire." He half smiled. "But I don't see Blanco getting far from Brother Eugene. Let's head back and see what luck the others have had." Their luck had been good. Brother Eugene, on Blanco, Miss Blackholt standing composedly beside, was waiting for them in the drive. "Here he is, and no harm done," said the monk, his cheer sounding a little forced. "I'll just put him in for the night again, and then I can come back and we can have our marathon, after I double-check the door." That reminded Ivy of a curious fact. She had found the garage door closed. She had slid it open to check on Blanco. The horse could have nosed open a sliding door that wasn't completely shut, but how and why would it close the door behind itself? But another thought thrust this question aside. "Oh, I still have to go get those extra acorns." A few minutes later, when she returned with the acorns, she was met by Brother Eugene, afoot and smiling, who escorted her into a chemin de fer marathon that lasted until 11:30. The routine continued. This included the comings and goings of Miss Blackholt and Lieutenant Fletcher in and out of the woods. The rate of these seemed to pick up, and Miss Blackholt, when she wasn't carrying the backpack, often carried other articles, little boxes, books, ribbons, a hand mirror. Ivy wondered about military secrets, remembered the strange attack of stuttering, and asked nothing. One night, the eavesdropping from the top of the stairs reached new heights. First, she heard furniture being moved and conversation in English. "Fletcher." "That far enough?" Blackholt. "Yes, you won't be that big." Fletcher. Do you have a screen?" Miss Blackholt. "What kind of screen?" Fletcher. "That I could change behind?" Blackholt sighs. "No, I do not. In any case, I require you to let me see the change. I can't just sense it. Or I could, but not as clearly. Is this modesty?" Fletcher. "Well, yes. Suppose our positions were reversed." Blackholt. "Just think of it as a kind of medical examination." There was a knock at the door. Miss Blackholt said, "Come in," and Ivy was surprised to hear Brother Eugene's voice. "Good evening. How are preparations going?" "Well enough," said Fletcher. "Oh, and stick to English. We'll be sharing this film with some trusted allies outside Grand Normandy." "Kurdians?" asked Brother Eugene. "Yes, brother," Miss Blackholt answered. "Certain specific Kurdians. Would you mind, please drink this now?" "Where shall I stand?" he asked, and was told, "Here." Ivy, perched at the top of the stairs, sat back and tried to sort through her bewilderments. What were they doing? Why was Lieutenant Fletcher shy about it? And they were apparently filming it for allies of Grand Normandy. Normandy was in France, she knew, but what did Grand have to do with it? And what were Kurdians? There was another knock. She heard the door open and Fletcher say, "You're early," curtly. "Better than late, sir," said Corporal Limney's voice, meekly. "True enough. Stand over there, then." "Brother Eugene," said Miss Blackholt in a reminding tone, "the antidote?" "Ah, right." A few seconds later, there were thudding sounds in a familiar rhythm. Had he brought Blanco with him? There was muttering too low to hear. Some discussion about batteries being charged, and more noises of furniture being moved. To Ivy's consternation, Lieutenant Fletcher appeared at the bottom of the stairs, but he was facing athwart the stairs into the living room, not looking her way. He looked very serious and was holding a white bundle. "Start when I start the camera," said Miss Blackholt, and he nodded. A whirring noise began, and Miss Blackholt spoke. "May 3rd, 1943, Session 52. Majory Field Laboratory, Oswick, Oxfordshire, Lieutenant Claudine Blackholt reporting." Fletcher put down the bundle and started unbuttoning his jacket. The bundle was very white with little glitters. Was it the embroidery? The volunteer seen here is Vanguard Lieutenant James Fletcher. The white cloth at Lieutenant Fletcher's feet is a seaming skin provided by Dr. Edward Blackholt of the Majory and adapted by myself. Lieutenant Fletcher and I have both practiced with it, and I have made observations of the spells involved, both while wearing it and while observing it worn. Spells? This was so surprising, Ivy did not notice Fletcher starting to take off his boots. Sessions 49 through 51 yielded no new information, so we are taking further steps. I will observe Lieutenant Fletcher as he goes through the change, not simply afterward. Ivy did notice Fletcher taking off his shirt and undershirt. Brother Eugene, please come in front of the camera. There was clopping. Evidently, Brother Eugene had brought Blanco. Sergeant Brother Eugene Diriclay of the Order of St. Martin and the Cavalry, dedicated, Fletcher said softly, stepping out of his pants. Brother Eugene took it up. Yes, late of His Majesty's Cavalry, now transferred to his newly constituted dedicated cavalry. To be sure, Miss Blackholt agreed. Sergeant Brother Eugene Diriclay is here serving as a basis for comparison. Ivy wasn't listening. Fletcher, his face studiously blank, had dropped his undershorts and kicked them aside. A flurry of memories went through Ivy's head. Dad working in the garden with his shirt off, a neighbor's baby boy getting his diaper changed, and most particularly, some statues of Greek athletes at the museum. Mom had lingered before them for a bit, then said, "Let's go see the glass flowers." Poor Lieutenant Fletcher, who looked very uncomfortable being filmed naked, and no wonder, was not in the Greek statue category, but he looked healthy and only a bit thin. He picked up the bundle of embroidery. It is important to note, Miss Blackholt went on, that Lieutenant Fletcher will only take on a seaming, while Brother Eugene has undergone an actual transformation. However, there are commonalities between the changes, and Dr. Blackholt and I have endeavored to make the seaming as much like a transformation as possible. Thus, we hope to use it as a model. There were some rustling, papery noises. Then Miss Blackholt said, "Brother Eugene, thank you. Lieutenant Fletcher, please proceed in 30 seconds. There were some clopping noises as Brother Eugene presumably got Blanco out of the way. Fletcher stood perfectly still for half a minute while Ivy decided whether decency required her to look away. She had nearly decided it did when Fletcher gave a little nod in response to some unseen signal and shook out the white cloth. Swirls of glitter shone on it. It was clearly the embroidery. It also had a large hole in it Ivy had never noticed before. Fletcher tossed up the edge in his hands, ducked under, and thrust his head and arms through the hole. Things happened too fast for Ivy to see clearly. Afterward, she did not know if she remembered or imagined what happened. According to the record in her mind, Fletcher's bare body thrust out through the hole, and he gave a sharp inhalation as of an expected shock. He held out his arms. They split into upper and lower arms. The lower ones had no fingers. No, they had one each, rapidly growing. Their shoulders slid down Fletcher's sides into billows of the embroidery. Meanwhile, the rest of the embroidery was wrapping itself tightly around Fletcher's legs and lower body. That body stretched and swelled, the embroidery flushed brown, and seemed to sink into Fletcher's skin. And it was done. 2 years ago, the movie Fantasia had reached Britain despite the problems of wartime commerce. She had seen it with Mom and Dad. She remembered the strange, pretty creatures cavorting in a candy-colored world of Greek mythology. That was Lieutenant Fletcher now. However, his coloring was normal, the same as before, and the new horsehide was an ordinary horsey brown, darkening on legs and tail to the same brown as Fletcher's own hair. What were the creatures called? She couldn't remember. Fletcher puffed out a big sigh, spread his arms, and turned where he stood. It was an intricate dance of 4 legs, and Ivy remembered Miss Blackholt mentioning practice. At one point in the turn, he was facing the stairs, of course. If he had looked up, he would have seen Ivy. He didn't. There was a busy scratching sound. Ivy realized Miss Blackholt was taking notes on what had just happened. No one spoke. Fletcher stood still except to switch his tail occasionally, and Ivy realized these notes were probably the most important result of the magic she had just witnessed. Finally, Miss Blackholt resumed, "As does any metamorphosis that violates homology, this seeming includes remapping the sensorium and apparent nervature. This entails qualia outside the normal human scope in proprioception, kinesthesia, and tactility." This seemed to be English, but it conveyed nothing to Ivy. "Lieutenant Fletcher and Brother Eugene have made independent reports on their experiences in these areas. See sessions 5, 6, 9, and 10. She went on in this way for a few minutes, sounding less and less understandable with each sentence, then said, "Brother Eugene, please give me a minute to get ready, then take this. Lieutenant Sanders, after Brother Eugene changes, please take off the skin." There was silence for a while, then she said, "Now, please." A short time later, Fletcher reached around with both hands and dug at the small of his back where man met horse. He gave another determined gasp as the horsehide bleached white and blossomed off him. He staggered and tried not to fall. In moments, he was standing naked on the mussed embroidery. He made a lunge for his shorts, fell to his knees, seized the shorts, then stood and put them on. While he got dressed, Miss Blackholt wrote frantically. Eventually, she said, "Brother Eugene, please come stand beside Lieutenant Fletcher." He obeyed and helped Fletcher, who was still folding up the magical embroidery. "I have made my observations of the thaumaturgical operation as Lieutenant Fletcher dropped his seaming and Brother Eugene assumed his. These will be appended to the report for session 52. This concludes the recording." The whirring noise in the background came to a stop. There was silence, except for some slight sounds of movement. Then Limney coughed and asked, "What have you discovered, ma'am?" "Nothing yet," she answered, not as crisp with him as she had been last time. "That is not how it works. You will have the film and sound recording to deliver to the Majory in just a few minutes, but it will take time for me to write up my notes in a lucid report, and more time that I cannot guess at to ponder what use we can make of them. Dr. Blackholt and our Kurdian allies will be pondering too. Come back tomorrow evening to get the full session write-up." "Yes, ma'am. Does it look like—" "Never mind, thank you. Thank you, ma'am." There were a few mechanical whirring noises, then he said, "Thank you, ma'am," apparently on receiving the recordings, and left. Ivy hurried to her window to watch him purr up the dark hill on his motorcycle. She returned to the top of the stairs and listened to them putting the furniture back, which seemed an anticlimax after the evening's events. Then she heard Miss Blackholt say, "I will just go and check on Ivy, though she ought to be asleep." Ivy nipped back to bed. Bare feet were good and silent, and the floor didn't creak. The real trick was looking relaxed enough. She heard more than one set of feet coming up the stairs. Then she felt presences in her room. "All serene," said Fletcher softly. "The tea can't be bad for her, can it?" asked Brother Eugene in an anxious murmur. "It's not a drug," Miss Blackholt replied, her voice just as low. "I just put an enchantment on some herbal tea. She is certainly alert during the day, worryingly alert." "What would you have done," asked Fletcher, "if she'd been awake?" Miss Blackholt sighed. "Started with a warning, I suppose." Ivy wondered how the adults could miss how tense she was, but they did, and then left her room. She had no idea how she got to sleep. Perhaps it was simply exhaustion from so much strangeness. She tried to get through breakfast normally, but it was an effort. She looked around the living room when she came down, but saw nothing out of place. Miss Blackholt sat at the kitchen table typing. Miss Blackholt often typed, though seldom at breakfast. Ivy realized that she must be writing up session 52, and all the other times must have been about other sessions, conducted in the woods, with Fletcher and sometimes Brother Eugene. She could not make up her mind how she felt about Miss Blackholt. She had been trying to put a sleeping spell on her every night since she got here. On the other hand, everything else about her had been hospitable and open, had seemed open. Well, no, when Ivy had asked about military secrets, she had tried to answer, but couldn't. More magic, that must be. She had been as open as she could be. Military secrets. Magical military secrets. Miss Blackholt, and presumably Brother Eugene and Fletcher too, had to keep secrets from her, were probably enchanted from telling her. But magical military secrets. Ivy was consumed with curiosity. "Are you feeling all right, Ivy?" Miss Blackholt asked, looking up from the typewriter and seeing Ivy frozen in thought, a spoonful of oatmeal poised midway. Ivy considered asking what she was working on, just to see her squirm, but reminded herself that Miss Blackholt was under orders. "Just thinking, miss, about where to go with Brother Eugene today." Miss Blackholt smiled. "I'm glad the two of you have struck up a friendship." Ivy nodded back, but could not bring herself to smile. They had told her from the start that they were keeping secrets about Brother Eugene and his condition, but now this seemed much more important and less tolerable. And there was Brother Eugene, waiting for her in the drive, on Blanco, wearing his white scarf. "Shall we start with a circuit of the green?" he asked. "All right." They started up the hill. It did not take Brother Eugene long to notice her grim silence. "Is anything the matter, Ivy?" Yes. Ivy did not put it into words, but she was more confused than she had ever been about the way the world worked. Brother Eugene watched anxiously as she breathed harder. Her next move depended on what she thought of Brother Eugene. She remembered him and the others coming to check on her. She decided. "Brother Eugene, do you tell me the truth?" He looked alarmed. Blanco reared his head a little. After a few seconds, the monk said, "Yes, as much as I can. But I think you know by now we are dealing in military secrets here. But as much as I can." Ivy nodded, turned, faced Blanco, and said, "Nice boy." She touched his nose. Or tried to. Her hand sank out of sight, touching nothing. The immaterial horse head reared away, and Brother Eugene gasped. She reached for Blanco's halter, and again her fingers touched nothing. Horse face and man face just stared at her, wide-eyed. She stared back. "Please show me the truth." Brother Eugene stared back for a long time. Finally he sighed and said, "Sankt Martin, St. Martin." Then, "You are so far in now." "Yes, but not here. Let us go to the woods." As they turned around and made their return, Ivy wondered about what she had just done and seen. She had acted on a hunch. She had known something was up with Blanco, so she had broken the ban on touching his head. But she had not known what the result would be. Now she thought she knew what truth she would be shown, but she didn't see how it fit in with the other doings last night. Brother Eugene had been doing his own reflection. "I take it you watched last night?" She nodded. "From the top of the stairs." He chuckled. "Poor Fletcher." "I didn't know he was going to do that," she protested. "Of course not." Well, they were in the back garden now. He opened the gate into the woods. Once they were a couple of turns down the path at a broad place, he halted. The smile had faded, and he looked worried now. "We had reasons for being secret, you know. One reason was to protect you. But we're past that now. Stand in front where you can get a good view." She obeyed. Blanco then parked out. He and Brother Eugene sighed. "This is a relief in a way," the monk remarked, and pulled off the white scarf. Her sight of him rippled like a reflection on water. Blanco's head simply went away. Brother Eugene slid forward, it seemed, to the position of the horse's neck, and his legs disappeared in ripples, as had the horse's head. The sight stabilized, and Brother Eugene spread his arms helplessly. "This is me now." "Blanco, was always me. And you're a what? Centaur. Creatures like me are called centaurs. But all those evenings when you were over playing cards, how did you manage to look human? That is Miss Blackholt's doing. She is working on a potion to let me resume human appearance, but the effect is fragile and doesn't last long. Resume? Yes, I started human. I really was a little boy in France long ago, then a young man, then an old man. I've only been a centaur for a few months. Well, what happened? Well, answering that means telling a story. He lay down in the path and patted the ground next to him. It seemed quite natural to Ivy to sit down beside him and lean against his side as he began to talk. And we will hear Brother Eugene's story next time.